Hello, my dear students of grade 9, welcoming you all to this history class. Today we shall be learning the first chapter, that is the French Revolution. So, these are some of the topics that you'll be learning from this chapter. The French society is known as a landmark in the history of Europe as well as the world, because this revolution led to an end of monarchy, that is, a kingship rule in France, and a new system of governance was introduced. The slogan of French Revolution mostly focused on liberty, freedom, and equality, and these three, that is, the liberty, freedom, and equality, become an important ideas of new era. Uh, the French Revolution was started on 14 July 1789. After this year, that is from 1789 onwards, people started the revolt. People started against the kingship rule, the monarchy rule in French society. We shall be learning the condition of the French society during the late 18th century. According to source, this is also one of the reasons which led to the outbreak of the revolution. So in 1774, Louis XVI of the Bourbon family became the king of the France. He was 20 years old and married to the Austrian princess called Marie Antoinette. So when Louis XVI became the ruler of France, he found an empty treasure. That is, he found that France was having a huge financial crisis because of the years of wars and an extravagant lifestyle, especially by the higher class society, which drained the financial resources of France. So the cost of maintaining the court become difficult and added to the problem. So in order to maintain the court and the palaces, he took a loan more than 2 billion livres. Livres is the unit of currency in France during the 18th century. It has discontinued in 1794 onwards. Today they are using euro currency. So Louis XVI took more than 2 billion livres of loan in order to maintain the court, in order to maintain the palaces. So this become difficult for the French government to meet its regular expenses such as maintaining army and maintaining the court. So due to this reason, the government was forced to increase the taxes to the people. In the 18th century, French society was divided into three estates. The first estates were called clergy. Clergies are those persons or those people who were involved in religious matters, especially the priest. So, members of this estate had a vast land and wealth. They were exempted from paying tax, and at the same time they enjoyed a certain privileges by birth. It has been found that during the 18th century, these first estates, that is a clergy, they were living in a very luxurious life because they were misusing the church tithes that was given by the people or by the peasants. So that was the first estate. The second estates are called nobility or the nobles. These nobilities, they belong to aristocracy. Now aristocracies are those people who have a higher social rank, um, typically by birth itself or by heredity itself. So they were having a huge land, at the same time they were having a title, and they hold many offices. So the member of these estates, they also enjoyed special privileges by birth, and they were exempted from paying tax. At the same time, these second estates, that is the nobility, they enjoyed a feudal system. Now, what is this feudal system? A feudal system is a social and political system in which the landholders, they provide land to the tenants or the peasants, which in exchange for their loyalty or in exchange for their services. So these second estates, they were enjoying these feudal privileges, and this is how they extract the feudal dues from the peasants. So that was the second condition of second estates. The third estates are the common people. Now, who are these common people? These common people are the rest of the population. They may be a businessman, the merchants, the lawyers, the artisans, peasants, the landless laborers, servants, and so on and so forth. So the member of this estate, that is the third estate, had a very few privileges and had to pay a taxes. So peasants were the important part of these estates, who constituted about 90% of the population. So only a few of them they owned land. 60% of the land cultivated by the peasants were owned by the nobles and the rich member of the third estates. So these estates, the third estates, they alone had a burden of financing the activities of the state. So this is the structures and the social status of the French society in the 18th century, which ultimately leads to the outbreak of the revolution, because there was no social equality between the three classes or the three estates, that is the first estates, the second estates, and the third estates. While the French societies were having an inequality in their social status, on the other side, they were also struggling to survive. In 1715 to 1789, the population of France increased from 23 million to 28 million. This led to a rapid increase in demand for food grains, but the production did not increase. The price of the bread also rose rapidly. Bread was their staple diet for the majority of the people. Most workers who were employed as a laborers were working as a fixed wages, so their wages did not keep pace with the rise in the price. So the gap between the poor and the rich became widened. It became worse when the bad weather condition reduced their harvest. So ultimately, this created a subsistence crisis. So subsistence crisis is an extreme situation where the basic means of livelihood, such as food, clothing, shelters, are endangered, are on the verge of collapse. So this was the condition of the people and the French society during the 18th century, which led to the outbreak of the revolution. Another social group emerged during the late 18th century. They were known as the middle class. Now, this middle class, they were the merchants, the manufacturers, the lawyers, administrators who were quite educated. They believed that no group of the society should be privileged by birth. Philosophers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Montesquieu's considered that these middle class were so responsible for the revolution. It is due to this middle class which ultimately again got a huge impact in the revolution, because they spread the ideas of freedoms, equal law, and opportunities of all. John Locke, who is a great philosopher during the French Revolution, in his book Two Treatises of Government, he criticized the doctrine of the divine and absolute right of the monarch, which means he made fun of the healthy lifestyle, the luxurious lifestyle living by the priests, and the absolute power that is holding by the monarchy. So he wrote it in his writing. Second is Rossio. Rossio also in his book The Social Contract, he put an idea forward proposing a forms of governments based on social agreement or social contract between the people and their representative. He suggested that the power should not only be empowered to the monarchy, but it should be given to all the responsibility should be given to all the people. So this is what he suggested, or he gave an idea through his book, that is the social contract. The third is Montesquieu. Montesquieu is also a famous philosopher. He, in his book The Spirit of Law, he stresses the concept of the separation of power, which today we are also using same, the power between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. So his concept of separation of power was a great instrument against the despotic autocratic rule of the French emperor. The ideas given by these philosophers in their writing has a huge impact in the French society. People started to discuss and spread among themselves through in the form of newspapers and books. So soon, when the news spread that the Louis XVI had planned to impose a further taxes to meet the expenses of the state, people started to generate anger and protest against the system of the privileges. So this led to the outbreak of the revolution. Let us now learn some of the incidents which led to the outbreak of the French Revolution. So, according to the old regime, according to old French society, the monarch had no power to increase the taxes of his own wish. If he wanted to pass a proposal, he had to call a meeting of the Estates General. Estates General is a political body in which the three estates send their representative. So King Louis XVI called for an assembly of the Estates General um, on 5th May 1789 in order to pass the proposal for the new taxes. So in Versailles is a royal palace, is a royal residence. An attractive and impressive hall was prepared by the King Louis XVI to host the delegate. The first and the second estates sent 300 representatives each. These representatives were seated in a rows facing each other on two sides. The 600 members of the third estate had to stand at the back. Mostly these representatives from the third estates belongs to more prosperous and educated members. Peasant, artisans, and women were denied to entry in the assembly, but they sent their demand and grievances through the representative. It was found that during this assembly, more than 40,000 letters was listed from outside the assembly, and they had a meeting. People started sending their demands and grievances during this assembly. During this assembly, members of this third estate demanded that voting should be done in a democratic way. That is, each member should have one vote, but this proposal was rejected by the king. And after the rejection of this proposal, the member of the third estate walked out of assembly in protest. Um, the third estate demanded that voting should be conducted by taking assembly as a whole, because this idea was supported by the Rousseau in his book, that is the social contract. When the demand for voting in a democratic way was rejected by King Louis XVI, on 20 June 1789, the representatives of the Third Estate assembled in the hall of an indoor tennis court in Versailles. Here, they declared themselves a national assembly. They also swore to draft a new constitution for France, which would limit the power of the monarchy, that is, the power of the kingship. The representatives of the Third Estate were led by two persons, that is, they are called Mirabeau and Abbé. Mirabeau was born in a noble family, but he discarded his feudal privileges and joined this Third Estate. Abbé was also originally a priest. He belonged to the first estate, but he also rejected his status and joined the third estate. He wrote an influential pamphlet and book called What is the Third Estate? We shall be learning how the revolt started at the Bastille. Bastille is the military building that was used as a prison during the 17th and 18th century. So this incident, this revolt, is a turning point to a French Revolution. While the National Assembly was busy making or drafting a constitution at Versailles, the rest of the France was in disturbance as a severe winter brought a bad harvest. This led to the increase in the price of the bread, and on the other side, the bakers exploited this situation by hoarding the supplies. Hoarding means hiding or storing away the supplies of the bread. So after spending hours in long queues at the bakery, crowds of angry women raided the shops. At the same time, the king also ordered the troops to move into the Paris in order to control this situation. So on 14 July 1789, which usually celebrated as National Day of the France, during this day, an agitated crowd destroyed the Bastille, because Bastille, during the time, Bastille was headed by most of the French people, because it symbolizes the dominating power of the king. So the attack this Bastille, and ultimately the peasant also looted the hoarding cranes, and they burned some of the documents and records. So consequently, a large number of after this incident, a large number of nobles moved to the neighboring countries. Seeing the power of these revolts, especially the Bastille revolt, King Louis XVI recognized the National Assembly, and he accepted that his powers would be checked by a constitution. So, on the night of 4th August 1789, France passed the law for abolishing the feudal system, that is, privileges owning by the nobles, and abolition of taxes. The members of clergy were also forced to give up their privileges. Tithes were abolished. Land owned by the church were also seized by the authority. So by this time, the government acquired an assets worth at least 2 billion livres. After all the revolt and incident happened in the year 1789, France has now become a constitutional monarchy. The National Assembly completed the draft of the constitution in the year 1791. The main objective of this drafting of constitution was to limit the power of the monarch. Now the power were separated and assigned to different institutions like the legislature, executive, and the judiciary. These changes in the power made France a constitutional monarchy. Under the new constitution, the laws were made by the National Assembly. Some of the highlight of the changes system are: men who were above 25 years of age and who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of their labor wage were given the status of active citizen. The active citizen means they have a right to vote. The remaining men and all the women were classed as a passive citizen. The second law made by the National Assembly is to qualify as an elector, and then to be a member of the assembly, a man had to belong to the highest brackets of the taxpayer. He should pay the highest amount of the tax. The third law made by the National Assembly is the Constitution began with the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. According to this declaration, right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, and equality before law were established as the natural rights, and it was the duty of the state to protect all these rights. We shall be learning how France abolishes monarchy, that is, the kingship rule, and becomes a republic. The situation in France continued to be tense in subsequent years, because even though King Louis XVI had signed the constitution, he entered into a secret negotiation with the King of Prussia. Rulers of France's neighboring countries were worried by the development in France after 1789. They made plans to send troops to put down the events that was taking place since 1789. But before this could happen, the National Assembly declared war against Prussia and Austria in April 1792. Thousands of volunteers joined the army, who saw war as a protest of the people against kings and aristocracy all over Europe. Among the patriotic songs sung by them was the Marseillaise, which was composed by the poet Roger de Esli. This song later became the national anthem of France. It was sung for the first time by the volunteers for Marseillaise as they march into Paris. After a revolutionary war with their neighboring countries such as Persia and Austria, another group of the society came up to fight against the oppressive restriction nature of the society. So this new group, two section of societies, they called themselves as the Jacobian Club. Now, the members of the Jacobian Club belonged mainly to the less prosperous section of the society. They included shopkeepers, artisans, cooks, shoemakers, watchmakers, printers, servants, and even the daily wage workers. Their leader was Maximilian Robespierre. They dressed differently by wearing a long striped trousers similar to those worn by the dock workers. They wanted to show themselves apart from the fashionable section of the society, especially the nobles who wore a knee-length breeches. Breeches are a short trousers fastened just below the knee, chiefly worn for riding. So this wearing of this type of dresses is a way of declaring the end of the power held by the wearers of the knee breeches. They came to be known as sans-culottes, meaning those without any breeches. So sans-culottes meant they wore a red cap that symbolizes liberty. Liberty means a state of being free from the oppressive restriction nature of society. So they wore a red cap in order to symbolizes the liberty. So Jacobian Club is also one of the famous club that came up during this French Revolution. In this topic, the convention, you shall be learning how France abolishes monarchy and declared as a republic. Now, on 10 August 1792, the Jacobians attacked the palace of the Tuileries with large number of Parisians. They killed the king's guard and held the king himself as a hostage for several hours. Later on, the assembly voted to imprison the royal family, including the King Louis XVI and his wife. Elections were held, and now all men above 21 years of age were allowed to vote. This newly elected assembly is called the convention. Now, through this newly elected assembly, they abolishes monarchy on 21st September 1792, and France was declared as republic. Now, what is republic? A republic was a form of government where the people elected the government, including the head of the government. So there is no hereditary monarch in a republic state. Louis XVI was sentenced to death by the court on the charge of the treason. Treason is a betrayal of one country or the government. So he was sentenced to death by the court on 21st January 1793. King Louis XVI was executed publicly at a place called de la Concorde. After some time, the queen, that is Mary Antonia, also met with the same fate. So she was also executed just like her husband, that is King Louis XVI. So ultimately, through this incident, France was declared as republic and have abolishes the monarchy system. After France abolishes monarchy and become a republic state, the period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as a reign of terror in France because Maximilian Robespierre, who is the leader of the Jacobian Club, followed a policy of severe control and punishment. Many people were arrested. They include those people who were considered as enemies, that is, ex-nobles, clergy, and members of the political parties. So if the court found them guilty, they were guillotined. Guillotined means they were beheaded by the device uh, of a heavy blade. So Churches were shut down, and these buildings and their buildings were become converted into an offices. So ultimately Robespierre became a virtual dictator of the France. Due to his hard policies, many supporters left him at the end. So he was also finally convicted by the court, and he was also beheaded, guillotined, in July 1794. Let us learn the role of women in the revolution. Women played a very significant role in the French Revolution. It was their active participation which brought important changes in French society. Um, Women in France were disappointed with the constitution of 1791 because this constitution has reduced them to be a passive citizen who had no political rights. They demanded political rights such as right to vote, right to be elected in the assembly, and right to hold political office. They also expressed their own views and demands. Women started their own political clubs and newspapers. So about 60 women clubs came up in different cities of France during the revolution, and of all them, one of the most famous clubs was the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women. So with their struggle for equal political rights, finally in 1946, French women won the right to vote. So, with their participation in revolutionary activities, laws were passed to improve the lives of the women. These changes were they gained access to education with the introduction of state schools and a system of compulsory education for girls. Women could no longer be forced into marriages by their fathers. They could marry at their will. Marriage were now a contract which could be registered under a civil law. Divorce was made legal. Both men and women could apply for this legal divorce. Women could also train for jobs, become artists, or run a small business. So these were some of the law passed to improve the lives of the women after their active participation in revolutionary activities. Students, you'll be learning again how France abolishes the slavery. So one of the greatest social reform made by the Jacobian government was to abolish slavery in French colonies. After a long debate and after a long struggle, the National Convention passed a law in 1794. It declared slavery as illegal and freed all the slaves in France's overseas colonies. After 10 years, Napoleon reintroduced his slavery system in order to please the plantation owners who considered enslaving African blacks as their right. So these slaves were known as African Negroes. Um, Finally, again, slavery was abolished in the French colonies in 1848. After 1789, many changes took place in the lives of women, men, as well as the children in France. The revolutionary government took it upon themselves to pass a law that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality into their everyday practice. One important law that came into effect after the storming of the Bastille in 1789 was the abolition of censorship. Censorship means separation of speech or public opinion or the information. So before 1789, people were suppressed for giving out their own rights, giving out their own opinions and information. So they have abolished this system, and a new declaration of rights and rights of the man and citizen was given. Under this, the rights of the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and Citizen, freedom of speech and expression become a natural rights of the man. This lead to the growth of newspaper, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures. They all discuss and describe the events and changes that takes place in France. Freedom of press also give a voice to opinion and counter opinions. Blaze songs and festive processions attract a large number of people. This was one way uh, of grasping and identifying the ideas of liberty or justice. We shall be learning now how Napoleon became the Emperor of France. That is the rise of Napoleon. In 1804 or in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte, a famous French general, he crowned himself the Emperor of France. He conquered many neighboring European countries and forced out the dynasty system, the monarchy system. He saw himself as a modernizer of Europe, and he also introduced many laws such as protection of private property, uniformity system of all the countries. So many people saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people. But soon his army came to be viewed everywhere as invader force. Finally, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Even after his defeat, the ideas of Napoleon on liberty and modern laws continued even in the other parts of the Europe. So one of the most important legacy that was given by the French Revolution is the idea of the liberty and democratic rights, which spread all over the Europe. This led to abolition of feudal system and freedom of colonized nation. Tipu Sultan, Rajaram Mohan Roys are some of the Indians who were inspired by the idea of the French Revolution. So students, these are some of the incidents and events that occurred during the French Revolution. I hope you have learned something through these slides and through this short explanation. We shall be learning the next chapter, that is socialism in Europe and the Russian Revolution, in the next chapter, that is chapter 2. So until then, study well, stay healthy and stay safe. Thank you.